The Widow of Black Hollow and Her Secret Breeding Archive, Georgia, 1838. Every document recovered from the Black Hollow estate raises a question that cannot be answered. The handwriting is precise, the ink faded to a copper brown, the paper brittle and almost translucent, yet the content, its calm, deliberate tone, suggests a mind utterly convinced of its own righteousness. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. There is no official record of Margaret Vale's arrival in Hollow County, Georgia, though local archives note that in March of 1838, a widow from Charleston purchased 200 acres of neglected farmland on the southern edge of the Oconee River. She paid in silver coin, transported in a single iron chest. Witnesses said she arrived in a black carriage drawn by 4 horses, accompanied only by one servant, a quiet man of uncertain age who never gave his surname. The property she acquired, later known as Black Hollow, had been abandoned since 1829, when fever took the previous owner's family. Locals avoided it. They said the soil was sour, that crops died in strange patterns as though the ground itself rejected cultivation. The few who lived nearby spoke of hearing low sounds from the fields at night, not quite human, not quite animal. Margaret dismissed such talk as superstition. She was, by all accounts, educated beyond the expectations of a Southern widow, trained in arithmetic, familiar with Latin, and in possession of several volumes of anatomical texts that had once belonged to her late husband, a physician. Neighbors called her distant but polite. She attended church twice before withdrawing altogether, claiming poor health. By autumn, she rarely left her property. What happened at Black Hollow between 1838 and 1842 remains uncertain. The records we have are fragments, letters, ledgers, receipts, yet even these offer glimpses of something deeply unusual. Margaret's household accounts, preserved in part by the Hollow County Historical Society, include repeated purchases of medical supplies, laudanum, chloroform, surgical instruments, and, curiously, iron weights. She also purchased 3 strong-bodied laborers from an auction in Milledgeville in September 1839, paying far above market price. Within months, 2 were listed as deceased due to fever. The third, a man referred to only as Noah, appears again in her journals. His name is followed by a symbol, a small cross within a circle, and the notation, sound constitution, suitable. At first glance, Margaret's writings resemble the meticulous records of an amateur scientist. She measured, catalogued, and described with precision, but the deeper one reads, the more the tone shifts. Her notes adopt a cold, clinical detachment that borders on obsession, measurements of skulls, descriptions of familial traits persisting through maternal inheritance, calculations regarding gestation, nourishment, and progenitive yield. What she sought to prove remains the central mystery. In one fragment, dated April 12, 1840, she writes, "If bloodlines may be corrected through deliberate pairing, then corruption is not divine but environmental. This would vindicate those unjustly condemned by birth." The phrasing is strange, vindicate those unjustly condemned by birth. Scholars later interpreted this as a reference to race, class, or perhaps heredity itself. Yet her subsequent entries complicate any simple moral reading. She describes subject trials, rejected offspring, and the necessity of isolation to prevent contamination. Locals began to whisper about the widow at Black Hollow. Children claimed to see lantern light moving through the fields long after midnight. A farmhand from a neighboring property reported hearing voices carried on the wind, low murmurs like recitations of prayer. In 1841, a midwife named Ruth Dandridge was summoned to the estate under mysterious circumstances. Her testimony, preserved in a letter written decades later, remains the only first-hand account of what occurred inside. Ruth described a house heavy with the smell of antiseptic and decay. In one room, she saw instruments too fine for farming, too cruel for medicine. Margaret herself appeared calm, dressed in mourning black, her hands stained with ink. Ruth was asked to assist with a birth, but found, instead of a mother in labor, a woman barely conscious. her wrists restrained, her body cold to the touch. Margaret instructed Ruth to record measurements as the subject expired. When Ruth refused, Margaret dismissed her without payment and forbade her from speaking of what she had seen. The midwife left Hollow County within the month. Her letter, dated 1882, begins simply, "I have tried to forget what was done in that house, but I still dream of her face." By 1842, Margaret Vale's name had vanished from county records, tax filing ceased, letters addressed to Black Hollow were returned unopened. For nearly a decade, the property lay in silence, overgrown, abandoned, its house sinking slowly into the earth. Only in 1851, when a group of surveyors mapped the area, did anyone enter the grounds again. What they found defied explanation. The main house stood half collapsed, its interior filled with broken furniture and scattered pages covered in indecipherable notations. In the cellar were rows of glass jars containing what appeared to be preserved organs. Nearby, in a locked cabinet, they discovered bones, human, small, delicate. Along one wall hung a series of framed sketches depicting infants, each annotated with measurements and dates. The most recent was labeled March 4, 1842. The sheriff of Hollow County ordered the material destroyed, calling it the work of madness. But one man, a clerk named Benjamin Aldred, secretly retained a handful of pages before the burning. Those pages, rediscovered in 1924 in a private collection in Macon, form the basis of what we know today. They reveal a woman attempting, through unspeakable means, to trace the inheritance of what she called moral deformity. Her belief, it seems, was that cruelty, obedience, and even faith itself were hereditary, traits that could be bred out or in through controlled lineage. She referred to her estate as a living archive of correction. No official investigation was ever conducted. By the time authorities considered the possibility of crimes committed at Black Hollow, Margaret Vale had been gone for nearly a decade. Some claimed she fled to Charleston, others said she died in her sleep, buried in the same field where her subjects were interred. All we know for certain is that in 1857, when a new owner attempted to rebuild the main house, his workers uncovered a network of shallow graves beneath the foundation. 37 in total. Each contained skeletal remains bound at the wrists. None bore markers. When asked about it, the foreman simply said, "We filled them back up and built over it." Today, nothing remains of the original structure except the cellar stones and the iron ring once used to hoist heavy loads from below. The air there, locals say, still smells faintly of lye and copper, even after a century of rain. What Margaret Vale truly intended, whether she believed herself a reformer, a scientist, or something far darker, may never be known. But her writings suggest one unshakable conviction: if God makes no distinctions in the soul, then man must correct his errors in the flesh. And that is where the story of Black Hollow begins. The hidden journal beneath the floorboards, the human body, is an archive that refuses to forget its corrections. Flesh remembers what the mind denies. Fragment attributed to M. Vale, recovered 1924. The story of Black Hollow might have ended with the burning of its records, had it not been for Benjamin Aldred, the county clerk who pocketed a few pages before the sheriff's men consigned the rest to flames. For 30 years, Aldred kept them hidden inside a hollowed Bible, afraid of ridicule, or perhaps of something worse. He died in 1891, and his grandson, Elias Aldred, a schoolteacher with antiquarian interests, discovered the bundle while cleaning the attic. Elias described the papers as brown with time, but not fragile, written in a hand so neat it seemed mechanical. Each page was numbered but out of sequence. The ink had bled in places as though water or blood had soaked the paper long ago. Among the pages was a single, separate leaf, labeled Private, Not for Archive. It contained an address, Charleston, Meeting Street, House of Dr. Percival Vale. Elias's curiosity overcame his better sense. In the summer of 1892, he traveled to Charleston to investigate, tracing what remained of the Vale family. Dr. Percival, he learned, had indeed been Margaret's husband, an anatomist and lecturer at the Charleston Medical Institute until his death in 1837, 1 year before Margaret vanished into Hollow County. But it was not Percival's death that unsettled Elias. It was what the locals remembered of Margaret. In Charleston's faded newspapers, he found a small notice dated June 2, 1837, funeral services for Dr. Percival Vale will be held privately. The widow requests no visitors, no flowers, and no inquiry into her late husband's research. No inquiry. Elias followed that phrase into the archives of the Medical Institute, where he uncovered a series of faculty memos discussing Percival's experiments on regenerative heredity, a theory that disease could be excised from bloodlines through selective breeding. It was controversial, blasphemous, and quietly condemned by the Church. When Percival died of fever, his notes were supposedly destroyed, but a letter from Margaret to the Institute, never sent, was still preserved in a drawer. Her handwriting was unmistakable. My husband's work remains incomplete, yet his premise is sound. If moral weakness may be bred out, then God's order can be refined, not defied. That phrase, God's order refined, appears again in the black hollow pages. Elias began to suspect that Margaret had not been mad, at least not in her own eyes. She believed she was continuing her husband's research, perfecting it through human subjects. When Elias returned to Georgia, he brought with him a small leather-bound journal purchased from an antiquarian shop in Charleston. The seller claimed it had belonged to a widow of a physician who fled the city after scandal. Inside, on the first page, was a single name written in delicate black ink, M. Vale, Hollow County. The entries began in 1839, roughly 1 year after Margaret arrived at Black Hollow. The handwriting was precise, emotionless. Yet beneath its order lay something fevered. The first pairing failed. The woman expired on the 9th month. The child was malformed, the eyes sunken, it could not breathe. Yet the structure of the skull suggests progress. I must continue. Further entries reveal her rationale. To cleanse the bloodline, one must observe the crossing of corruption with purity. Only through degradation can virtue be isolated. I am not God's rival. I am his assistant. She wrote of Noah, the enslaved man from Milledgeville, in clinical but oddly reverent tones. Subject Noah demonstrates exceptional strength and composure under observation. Unlike others, he neither weeps nor prays. There is serenity in him, as though he has already forgiven what I do. Then an entry dated February 1841. Noah has begun to question. He asks if the children will be free. I cannot answer. He says freedom means nothing if they are not named. I have promised him that the next child will have a name. He smiled. I have not seen him smile before. That line, the next child will have a name, haunted Elias, because months later, Margaret's entries shift abruptly from the language of research to confession. I hear them crying below even when the cellar is silent. The air is wrong here. The walls pulse when the lantern burns too long. I have sealed the lower chamber, but they do not rest. They demand names. After this, the handwriting changes, and even trembling. Noah has vanished. The last mother refused to breathe after birth. The child lives but does not cry. Its eyes follow me, though it cannot yet see. I believe I have created what God intended to hide. The next page is blank except for a single word, written diagonally across the paper, correction. Elias's disappearance. Elias showed the journal to 2 colleagues from the Hollow County Historical Society in 1893. Both attested to its authenticity. They planned to publish a paper on antebellum pseudogenetic experiments, but before they could, Elias vanished. His cottage near the Oconee River was found undisturbed except for the journal, placed neatly on his desk, open to a page he had marked with a dried magnolia leaf. On that page, written faintly in new ink, was a final entry in an unfamiliar hand. The blood remembers its architect. Local papers reported that Elias likely drowned. The river often flooded that spring, but those who knew him doubted it. He had always feared deep water. When the sheriff's men drained part of the bank, they found only his lantern and a single silver coin, blackened with age, stamped with the initials M.V. The cellar in 1924, nearly 80 years after Margaret's disappearance, a group of university archaeologists began excavating the remnants of Black Hollow. Officially, the project was to study early plantation architecture. Unofficially, it was funded by a private collector who wanted proof of Margaret's experiments. On the second week of digging, workers uncovered a cellar sealed with limestone and tar. Inside were 3 iron tables bolted to the ground and a brick furnace still coated with soot. Beneath one of the tables, they found what appeared to be a floor hatch leading deeper still. When they pried it open, the air that escaped was described as sweet, like rot and perfume. The chamber below was narrow, lined with dozens of small alcoves carved into the earth. Each alcove contained a bundle wrapped in cloth. When unwrapped, the bundles revealed remains infant skeletons, dozens of them, each marked with a lead tag bearing a number. But what chilled the men most were the final 2 alcoves, which contained something different. One adult skeleton, female, wearing a ring inscribed with M.V., and beside it another, smaller skeleton positioned as though reaching for her hand. In the official report, the discovery was listed as funerary anomalies. The site was sealed. The collector withdrew his funding. No further excavations were authorized. The letter, a final note, survives. A letter written by one of the archaeologists before his death in 1931. It was found among his papers decades later. We were told to leave it alone, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the faint sound of breathing from beneath the earth. I think she succeeded, you see. I think she corrected us all. The breathing earth inheritance is not confined to flesh. Belief itself can reproduce. Uncatalogued note, Dr. Alton Care Collection, University of Savannah Archives. The legend of Black Hollow slept for almost half a century after the 1924 excavation. Then, in 1957, a rural electrification crew arrived to install new lines across the old Vale property. The foundation stones of the manor still jutted from the kudzu-like teeth. When the foreman drove a post-hole auger into the slope, the machine struck something soft and the motor seized. What they pulled up was not soil but linen, damp, gray, and faintly pink. The sheriff sealed the site within the hour. A month later, the University of Savannah announced a limited academic review of recovered artifacts. No public statement followed. The archivist in 1959, Dr. Alton Care, a medical historian recently returned from the Korean War, obtained access to the sealed material. Care described himself as merely cataloging the detritus of local hysteria. But his personal field diary, later found among his papers, betrays a different tone, one of fascination sliding toward awe. March 9, initial inventory complete. 1 bone samples, 6 fetal, 15 adult. Most show anomalous cranial symmetry, mirror images rather than lateral deviation, impossible without deliberate intervention. March 11 sample #8 emits faint odor of ozone when exposed to lamplight. Chemical cause unknown. March 14 dreamt of a woman in morning dress standing at the foot of my bed. When I woke, my pulse was irregular but steady, precisely double normal rhythm. Care's colleagues dismissed his findings as exhaustion. By April, he had begun referring to the remains not as subjects but as the continuation. The film reel among the boxes labeled M.V. was a rusted tin canister containing 8 feet of deteriorated 16 mm film. When repaired, it revealed brief footage, 3 seconds of handheld black and white imagery. The camera moves through a cellar, 3 tables, a furnace. A woman's voice, soft, composed, speaks from outside the frame. The 12th has survived 40 hours. The pulse is steady. The eyes are aware. Then the film abruptly ends. Care noted that the voice matched a surviving wax cylinder labeled Vale Instruction. When he played the cylinder, he heard only static, until the final 2 seconds when a whisper surfaced. Names are correction. That night, the janitor found Kerr unconscious on the archive floor. He was revived easily, though he could not recall collapsing. He did, however, insist that someone had been humming in the dark. The return to Hollow County compelled by what he called the unfinished archive. Kerr traveled to Hollow County in August 1959. Local records show he signed the Black Hollow property ledger at 5:42 p.m. He was never seen again. A search party found his Jeep abandoned at the edge of the old Plantation road. Inside were 3 items: a reel recorder, a leather satchel containing Margaret Vale's journal, and a typed note addressed to the Department of Anatomical Studies. "I have traced the rhythm. It is not hereditary, it is architectural. The ground itself repeats the sequence." The recorder held 4 minutes of audio: rain, footsteps, then Kerr's voice, basement intact, smells sterile, lime and copper, floor uneven, there's a sound below me like air moving through clay. Pause, no, breathing, it's breathing. A faint heartbeat follows, slow but unnervingly regular. Then, after a long interval, Kerr's voice again, quiet, calm, almost reverent. She corrected us all. The tape ends with a sudden distortion, a wet, dragging exhale. The investigators' notes in 1972. Journalist Clara Henley reopened the case for a regional magazine article titled "The Widow of Black Hollow, Georgia's Forgotten Frankenstein." Most readers assumed it fiction. Her unpublished research, donated to the Historical Society decades later, reveals that she had located Kerr's missing field trunk in a municipal storage vault. Inside she found a glass vial half filled with murky fluid labeled Noah 12, several lead tags numbered sequentially from 90 to 112, and a map of the hollow property with circles drawn where the soil temperature read consistently warmer than the surrounding ground. Henley visited one of those circles, a small depression ringed with pines, and described feeling a low vibration like standing above a distant engine. She left before nightfall. Her final diary entry reads, "It hums louder when you say her name." 2 weeks later, she resigned from the magazine and moved to Oregon. She never wrote again. Present day in 2023, graduate researcher Evelyn Kerr, Alton Kerr's granddaughter, submitted a Freedom of Information request for the Black Hollow materials. She received a polite denial. Collection does not exist. Yet 3 months later, an anonymous envelope arrived at her university mailbox containing a single Polaroid. It shows a concrete wall marked with damp handprints arranged in symmetrical pairs, left mirroring right. On the back, written in neat, old-fashioned script, "The blood remembers its architect." Evelyn recorded a voice memo that evening. Her transcript survives on a cloud backup retrieved by police after her disappearance in March 2024. The pattern repeats in our line: 2 heartbeats, perfect sync. Grandfather wrote that he felt it before the end. I can feel it now, especially when I'm near running water. Sometimes it sounds like another breath inside mine. I dream of her hands pressing the soil, molding something that still moves. If this recording stops abruptly, it's because the air has changed again. The ground is breathing. Static follows, then a single exhalation impossibly close to the microphone. Epilogue in 2025. Construction crews breaking ground for a new reservoir along the Oconee uncovered a basement of lime, washed brick identical to the 1924 reports. Officials ordered the chamber sealed within hours. The crew chief later told a reporter off record, "It wasn't bones down there, least not just bones, looked more like roots, but soft, they were moving, the site remains closed." Residents claim that when the river's low in summer, you can hear a slow, even rhythm rising from beneath the dam, not a drum, not machinery, something older, steady, patient. And sometimes in the night air a woman's voice hums an unfinished lullaby, the kind sung to a child who never learned to cry. The correction continues. Every archive becomes a womb when memory begins to breathe. Anonymous marginalia, Black Hollow deposit, undated when the Oconee Dam was completed in late 2025. Most assumed the last trace of the Vale estate now slept beneath 40 feet of water. But 3 weeks after the floodgates closed, the reservoir's monitoring buoys began recording rhythmic pressure fluctuations, precise intervals of 68 seconds apart. Hydrologists blamed air pockets. The locals called it the second heartbeat. An internal memorandum from the Georgia Water Authority, dated Nov 4, 2025, notes, unusual subsurface pulsation persists. Pattern corresponds to an organic respiration cycle rather than mechanical fault. The file was sealed, marked proprietary environmental data. The digital rediscovery in early 2026, fragments of Dr. Alton Care's missing field audio surfaced online through an anonymous upload on a defunct paranormal forum. The file, named Black Hole 3, WAV, contained barely 3 minutes of sound. At the 30-second mark, a woman's voice can be heard beneath static, repeating 3 words, give them names. Spectrogram analysis revealed the voice forming a perfect bilateral mirror image, frequencies folding onto themselves like a reflection. The engineer who performed the test later described hearing a pulse between the left and right channel that did not originate from either. Shortly afterward, the forum was deleted without explanation. A single repost appeared on social media 2 nights later under the caption #the correction. Within days, users began claiming that playing the file backwards produced a second voice, whispering, "We are awake." The Black Hollow manuscript in the spring of 2027, a courier package arrived at the Savannah Historical Society addressed simply to the archivist. Inside, one tattered ledger bound in untreated leather, its pages filled with densely written script. No return address, no sender. The handwriting matched that of Margaret Vale, but the first page was dated March 12, 2026. The initial entry read, "I have watched generations attempt to bury me. They lay their concrete, their iron, their ignorance, but flesh remembers, the blood corrects." Subsequent entries shifted between archaic diction and modern references, a voice that knew the language of both centuries. Whoever wrote it had studied the Vale archive intimately. Yet some phrases carried details never made public. The arrangement of alcoves beneath the cellar, the number carved into each lead tag, the lullaby Margaret hummed to the unnamed infants. The final page contained only a set of coordinates corresponding to the reservoir's southern shore. The ink appeared fresh when catalogued. It was still damp to the archivist's fingertip. Within a week, that archivist resigned, citing prolonged auditory disturbances. He refused to elaborate but left behind a note. It calls from the water by name. The field footage late that summer, a group of graduate filmmakers visited the reservoir to shoot a documentary about Southern folklore. Their recovered camera, found floating near the spillway, contained 31 minutes of video. The footage begins harmlessly, laughter, lake reflections, dusk settling over drowned pines. Then the microphone picks up a rhythmic thudding beneath the water. At the 20-minute mark, one student remarks, "It's counting, one for each of us." Another laughs nervously. Moments later, bubbles break the surface beside the boat, followed by a hollow hiss like air escaping from the earth itself. The camera tilts downward as the students shout. For a few frames, something pale moves just below the surface, long, limbed, hair flowing like river grass. Then the lens fogs. The recording ends with a voice calm, almost maternal, saying, "Not yet perfect, but close." No bodies were recovered. The present inquiry in 2028, the newly formed Department of Historical Pathology issued a confidential circular reviewing potential biogenic phenomena. In Hollow County, its conclusion, though heavily redacted, admits that trace hemoglobin was detected within the sediment strata of Lake Vale inconsistent with known fauna. A final note reads, "Replication rate undetermined, advise containment via continual submersion, do not drain." The Whisper Network, meanwhile, among the darker corners of the internet, a cult-like community has grown around fragments of the Vale writings. They call themselves the Corrected. Members post images of mirrored scars along their ribs, claiming to hear the second pulse after midnight. One message thread collects lullabies allegedly transcribed from dreams. Each begins the same way: "Sleep, my vessel, sleep, the water keeps the breath for you." Authorities dismiss the group as performance art. But investigators tracing the posts' IP addresses discovered that many originated from a single block of rural Georgia phone towers. directly above the drowned foundations of Black Hollow. The archivist's addendum, a final memorandum appended to the sealed case file, author unknown, dated September 2029. If the ground beneath the reservoir continues its respiration, the structure may fail within decades. Recommend periodic auditory monitoring. Do not disturb sediment below 20 meters. The correction is not extinction, it is symmetry. Below the typed text, a handwritten addition in a woman's fine cursive, names recorded: Margaret Vale, Percival Vale, Noah, Benjamin Aldred, Elias Aldred, Dr. Alton Kerr, Clara Henley, Evelyn Kerr, and now yours. The final transmission tonight. While reviewing this file, you hear it too, the faint double rhythm beneath the hum of your own heartbeat. For a moment you imagine it syncing, breath aligning with breath, as if something unseen is learning your pattern. Maybe it's the room settling, maybe it's just blood in your ears, or maybe the widow of Black Hollow has found one more listener willing to keep her alive, one more vessel to carry the correction forward. If you feel that second pulse, do not answer when it calls your name. The doctrine of correction, what the flesh remembers, the mind will someday rationalize. Fragment from the Vale Laboratory Notes, 1841, the first official mention of Margaret Vale's doctrine of correction, appeared in a single-page memorandum preserved among the Oconee County probate records. Dated June 12, 1841, it described a private scientific enterprise conducted under the auspices of Mrs. M. Vale, formerly of Charleston, and requested discretion in the handling of anatomical waste and burial allotments. To most clerks, it was meaningless paperwork. To those who knew Margaret personally, it marked the moment she stopped pretending her work was moral inquiry and began treating it as divine entitlement. The purpose she invented after her husband's death in 1839, Margaret withdrew almost completely from society. Visitors noted a growing hostility toward churchmen and physicians alike. She considered both hypocrites who pretended to heal while secretly maintaining the same hierarchies of sin. By the spring of 1840, she had begun keeping notebooks filled with diagrams of human reproductive organs, annotated with phrases like lineal convergence and inheritance of conscience. To her few remaining friends, she said she was studying how cruelty perpetuates through bloodlines. But her notes show something darker. An obsession with purifying moral weakness through selective breeding, as if she could rewrite human nature itself. Every drawing was signed M. Vale and dated precisely, as though she meant her descendants, or investigators, to understand the evolution of her thinking. The Cellar Laboratory by autumn 1841, the cellar beneath Black Hollow had changed. What had once been a storage room for wine and produce now contained 3 heavy tables lined with oilcloth, a set of brass measuring calipers, and a row of jars filled with suspended organs and tissues. The air smelled of spirits and lye. A surviving receipt from a Savannah apothecary confirms regular purchases of formalin, chalk, and binding thread. Margaret was no longer recording genealogies, she was creating them. 2 surviving letters from her assistant, Noah Aldred, describe nights spent cataloging the misbegotten, though he never clarifies what he meant. In one letter he writes, she believes she can remove the stain, as though sin itself were tissue that might be excised. Noah vanished in 1842. His name never appears again in county records. The experiments Margaret's ledgers list 17 pairings, each between individuals she described as morally divergent, one descended from enslaved stock, the other from families of the pulpit. Her justification, to create a new human type untainted by the arrogance of the master or the bitterness of the enslaved. No births are directly recorded, but between 1842 and 1846, parish baptism logs list 6 unnamed infants baptized at the request of Mrs. Vale. All died before age 2. Causes of death: fever, wasting, or unknown. Among her papers found decades later was a line written in the margin of a medical manual: purity cannot survive exposure. It is unclear whether she meant the infants could not live, or that the public must never know of them. The doctrine becomes religion by 1845. Margaret's journal entries read less like scientific notes and more like scripture. She began referring to herself as the corrector. She wrote of her dead husband not as a man but as the prototype of weakness, whose failure had compelled her divine work. She held small gatherings at night, neighbors, tenants, and the wives of local physicians, lecturing on the arithmetic of guilt. Those who attended said she spoke in a voice calm and almost kind, yet her eyes appeared to drift, as if watching something only she could see moving along the wall. In one surviving sermon draft she wrote, "If the blood carries sin, then the surgeon is priest. Let incision be baptism." A few months later, a farmhand named Elias Aldred went missing after delivering lumber to the estate. No one connected it to her at the time, but later examination of the cellar revealed a foundation stone dated that same week, one stone that sounded hollow when struck. Dr. Alton Care's arrival in 1847, a young physician from Philadelphia arrived in Oconee County, claiming he had been invited by Mrs. Vale to assist in a study of hereditary disease. Dr. Alton Care was 26, ambitious, and poor. He saw the widow's patronage as a way to secure his reputation. Within months, he began writing private notes to colleagues expressing concern about her unorthodox anatomical methods. He described corpses with no evident trauma but signs of exsanguination, and specimens showing incision patterns inconsistent with medical instruction. Still, he stayed. The pay was generous. His final letter before silence, dated February 12, 1848, reads, "The subject in room 3 spoke. She asked for her mother. I believe she meant Mrs. Vale." No record of room 3 exists. The silence of 1849 by the following year. The Black Hollow Plantation ceased public operations. Tax records list the property as inactive. Local rumor held that disease had struck the estate. Others said the widow had gone mad, walking the halls at night whispering to the perfected. The census of 1850 lists no living residents at Black Hollow besides one woman, age 40, Margaret Vale. Her household servants were gone, the fields untended, the stables empty. Yet her ledgers show constant activity, inventories of tissue, sketches of skeletal deformations, and charts mapping eye, color to moral disposition. The final entry for that year reads simply, "Correction requires recurrence." The hidden doctrine in later years, researchers concluded that Margaret's doctrine of correction wasn't only about heredity, it was about atonement through replication. Each act of violence, she believed, could be rewritten by performing its inverse upon herself. If she had taken a life, she must give one. If she had lied, she must record the truth. In her mind, the ledgers were that truth, the proof that sin could be systematized and eventually balanced. When modern historians translated or ciphered notes in the mid-20th century, they found one chilling annotation beside a series of sketches. "When perfection is complete, they will rise with my breath." It remains unclear whether she meant spiritual resurrection or something more literal. Margaret Vale died on January 4, 1850, or so the probate declaration claimed. No body was ever buried under that name, yet in 1862, a census taker recorded a Mrs. M. Vale, living under another surname 2 counties north. The description matched: age, appearance, handwriting, all aligned. If true, it means the widow of Black Hollow continued her work in secret for another decade. And if the rumors of her later writings are accurate, Part 6 of this story reveals what she attempted next, an experiment not upon the enslaved nor her peers, but upon herself. The body that would not die to perfect the soul, I must perfect its vessel. Fragment Vale Journal No. 7. 1850, the years between 1850 and 1854 are almost blank in the county archives. No census activity, no property correspondence, not even burial permits from the surrounding hamlets. It was as though the region around Black Hollow had been swallowed. The only document dated from that period is a receipt for surgical glass tubing and preserving fluid. purchased in bulk under the name M. Vale for instructional use. By then, Margaret was no longer conducting experiments upon others. Her last known assistant, Dr. Alton Care, had vanished. Neighbors said the widow's shutters never opened, and that a low, mechanical hum sometimes drifted across the marsh after midnight, as though the swamp itself were breathing. The self-experimentation the surviving fragments of Journal No. 7, found in 1912 by a local surveyor, reveal a disturbing turn. Margaret wrote of her own body as an imperfect vessel for continuity. She believed that through controlled injury and anatomical exchange, she could cleanse the inherited weakness she claimed to carry from her husband's bloodline. On March 8, 1851, she wrote, "The soul may dwell within marrow. If so, the marrow can be renewed." What followed were crude procedures performed upon herself. Her notes mention voluntary extraction of tissue, purging of old blood, and replenishment from the preserved. One entry lists the initials N, A, and E, A, likely Noah and Elias Aldred, beside the words compatibility successful. When the journal pages were analyzed decades later, faint fingerprints belonging to multiple individuals were detected in the ink. At least one belonged to a person no older than 15. The chamber below in 1852, a traveling mason named Wendell Pierce was hired for structural repairs. His descendants' testimony, recorded in 1903, describes a vaulted corridor below the house that seemed built for something larger than men. He recalled the air was heavy with iron and salt. In the farthest chamber, he saw a shape draped in linen, its outline unmistakably human, but unnaturally long. He was dismissed before completing the work. Weeks later, Margaret sent a sealed note to the Oconee County Registry requesting exclusive property rights to subterranean improvements. No registry official ever saw what those improvements were. The voice in the records when her letters to Dr. Care were uncovered years later, archivists noted the tone shift between 1848 and 1852. At first, the widow had written to him as a colleague, clinical, precise. Later letters read as if she were writing to herself through him. In one, she says, "Your silence confirms the merge was successful." Another reads, "I will no longer require correspondence. You are within me." There was speculation that she used Care's body for transfusion experiments, transferring blood, possibly tissue, under the belief that her subject's moral attributes would enter her physiology. But the letters imply something stranger, that she considered identity transferable, that consciousness could be absorbed through purified contact. In her last undated page she writes, "I am not alone inside myself." The hospital ledger, a single entry from the Savannah Infirmary, dated October 14, 1853, notes the admittance of a Mrs. M. Vale, age indeterminate, suffering from neurological instability following loss of blood and prolonged isolation. She was released 3 weeks later, despite having no measurable pulse for 1 hour before recovery. One attending physician, Dr. Silas Penroy, wrote privately to a colleague, "Her skin was pale to translucence, veins dark as pitch, yet her mind lucid and accusatory. She insisted she could hear our hearts beating from across the ward. After discharge, she returned to Black Hollow and was not seen again for months." The autumn incident in November 1853, the sheriff received a complaint from nearby farmers about the smell of burning flesh. When officers visited, they found the house locked, the windows painted black from inside. Through one unsealed pane, they saw what appeared to be a human shape suspended from a ceiling pulley, its chest cavity open, ribs spread. A journal found later, believed to be Margaret's, described this as the reversal ritual. She wrote, "The host must be emptied before reception, my body a vessel, my mind the chapel, Care will rise within, perfected." The sheriff's men broke in the next morning, but the room was empty, no body, no pulley, no blood. Only a single word carved into the wall above the hearth, "merge." The posthumous birth in March 1854. Midwife Etta Caldwell delivered a stillborn infant at a farmhouse 2 miles from Black Hollow. The mother was described as a tall, veiled woman claiming to be a widow displaced by war. Etta's written account, preserved in the county's folklore archives, describes the child as smooth-skinned, with no navel, and eyes that did not close. Before she could record a name, the woman vanished with the body. Days later, footprints, bare, small, and in pairs, were found near the creek. Each pair overlapped perfectly, as if 2 identical feet walked in exact unison. That spring, Margaret Vale's name appeared one last time in a local advertisement for medical consultation and inheritance analysis. After that, nothing. The Red Ledger in 1904, a team of historians cataloging antebellum estates, rediscovered the Black Hollow basement. Among the mold and collapsed beams, they found a red leather ledger sealed in wax. Inside were 17 pages of anatomical sketches, each labeled Phase 2. At the end was a note written in the same thin, slanted hand: "She has become multiple. The marrow has taken root in silence. Chemical analysis confirmed traces of human tissue within the ink itself." The handwriting matched Margaret's, but the signature did not. It read, "A care." The theories historians have long debated what truly happened inside Black Hollow during those final years. Some insist Margaret's surgery was metaphorical, a poetic delusion of a guilt-ridden mind. Others point to forensic anomalies, bones found decades later in the cellar, fused together in ways unknown to 19th-century medicine. One theory proposes that she successfully merged cellular material from multiple bodies, primitive chimerism. Another, whispered by locals, claims she transferred her mind entirely, not into one body but several. Those who believe the latter say her descendants still show her face in fragments. One child's eyes, another's hands, a woman's voice repeating the phrase "correction" requires recurrence. The surviving specimen, when researchers reopened the estate in 2029, thermal imaging revealed a cold cavity beneath the cellar floor. Inside was a stone table, and upon it a preserved female body fused with remnants of a second, skin stitched to skin, veins blackened but intact. Tests identified both as human. One strand of DNA matched remains from the original Margaret Vale. The other belonged to Dr. Alton Kerr. Her eyes, even after centuries, remained open. The children of the merge, her legacy is not in the earth, but in the repetition of faces. Excerpt from Dr. Eleanor Pritchard's Genealogical Anomalies of the American South, 1921. By the turn of the century, Black Hollow had become less a location and more a rumor. Travelers spoke of the estate as a rotted skeleton half sunk in the marsh, its windows blind with salt, its walls breathing in dampness and silence. But in nearby hamlets, particularly those west of Oconee County, birth records began to show something unusual. Between 1898 and 1906, 6 families, all unrelated by name, delivered infants with matching congenital anomalies: left iris darker than the right, an additional joint in one thumb, and a faint birthmark at the base of the neck shaped like a downward crescent. Locals began calling it the Hollow Sign. The inheritance of shape medical officials from the Savannah College of Anatomy studied the families in 1907. Their report, dry and cautious, called it a regional phenotypic recurrence likely due to endogamy. Privately, however, the lead examiner, Dr. Samuel Derry, admitted his unease. He wrote in a letter later published posthumously, "Their faces are too alike. Infants born to mothers who share no ancestry somehow resemble each other wide eyes, pale irises, and an expression that seems, even at birth, to be watching." What unsettled Derry most was the language delay. Many of the children did not speak until the age of 6 or 7, but when they did, their first words were identical: "I remember." When asked what they remembered, none could explain. Yet several drew pictures of an underground room with a single hanging light and a woman standing beside a long table. The woman with the veil in 1909, during the height of the Hollow Sign cases, a midwife named Clara Wynne reported that a tall, veiled woman attended several rural births. She claimed to be a nurse sent from Savannah, though no records supported her employment. Wynne described her as unnaturally calm, her hands cold even in summer, her eyes the color of paper soaked in tea. After each delivery, she insisted on washing the newborn herself, murmuring a short phrase under her breath. Wynne thought it Latin, others recalled only fragments, puritas per iterationem, purity through repetition. Months later, Clara Wynne disappeared. Her house was found undisturbed, table set for two, midwifery bag missing. Inside her journal, the final entry read, "She came again, the same face but older or newer. She said the blood must stay awake." The census omission when the 1910 U.S. Census reached Oconee County, several enumerators filed complaints about non-compliant homesteads. In one, the official claimed that 3 households refused to list the number of children, stating, "They are not mine to count." In another, a man reportedly shut the door and whispered, "She comes when the moon tilts wrong. She asks to see her reflection in them." Authorities dismissed these as superstitions among poor sharecroppers. But tucked inside the census ledgers, archivists found a loose scrap of paper, a note scrawled by one of the field agents. Too many of them look the same, as if born from a single face multiplied. The agent resigned 2 weeks later and never worked again. The study of Dr. Pritchard in 1920, geneticist Dr. Eleanor Pritchard was hired to conduct a private investigation into the hollow sign phenomenon. She approached it scientifically, collecting blood samples, family trees, and photographs. Yet her 1921 paper, Genealogical Anomalies of the American South, reads more like a confession than research. She notes that several families refused to speak her name aloud, calling her the Revenant. When she compared photographs of mothers across different counties, she observed subtle similarities, an identical curve to the jaw, the same asymmetry in the left pupil. In the book's appendix, a grainy photograph shows Pritchard herself examining a child. Behind them, reflected faintly in the glass of a window, appears the face of another woman, blurred but wearing a long black veil. Pritchard never mentioned the reflection in her text. 6 months after publication, she was found dead in her laboratory, her face partially dissolved by chemical burns. Her final note read, "The merge was never completed. It is still correcting itself." The Hollow School by the 1930s, local authorities converted part of the old Vale estate into a boarding school for unfit and neglected children. They called it the Hollow Institute, though older residents whispered its original name, the Correction House. Teachers began reporting strange behavior. Children would vanish for hours and reappear beneath the floorboards, dirty but unharmed. When questioned, they claimed they had been talking to the woman who hums. In 1937, a groundskeeper uncovered a sealed well behind the east dormitory. Inside were fragments of paper preserved by the damp, pages of handwriting unmistakably belonging to Margaret Vale. One sentence repeated dozens of times, "They will be my marrow's testimony." Within a year, the school closed. Every record of its existence was quietly removed from the state archive. The revivalists in 1964, a cult calling itself the successors of correction, began meeting in Atlanta. They claimed descent from Margaret Vale and sought to complete her doctrine of purification. Their rituals involved recitations of her medical notes and controlled blood exchanges among members. A police raid on their farmhouse in 1967 uncovered several glass containers labeled Phase 3 viable. Each contained preserved tissue suspended in formalin. DNA testing decades later confirmed a human female origin, genetically consistent with multiple modern Oconee families, though none shared known common ancestors. The cult vanished soon after, leaving behind only one message carved into a basement beam: "She sleeps beneath our ribs." The return to Black Hollow when the estate was re-examined in 1992, after a series of unexplained livestock mutilations nearby, investigators found the cellar entrance bricked over. Thermal scans revealed movements, small, rhythmic pulses, beneath the floor. Excavation uncovered what looked like dozens of tiny ossuaries arranged in a perfect spiral. Inside each was a tooth, all human, all belonging to children no older than 10, each marked with a crescent carved into the enamel. Forensic analysis identified several of the teeth as belonging to children recorded as missing from the Hollow Institute half a century earlier. A single inscription ran along the lowest wall. Correction does not end, it propagates. The genetic proof in 2028, DNA sequencing of descendants in Oconee County revealed anomalies that defied ordinary heredity. Certain mitochondrial sequences appeared identical across multiple, supposedly unrelated families. Researchers labeled it ancestral type M, suspecting an ancient maternal founder, yet the genome pattern matched none found outside the region, and, disturbingly, aligned almost perfectly with samples taken from the preserved remains of Margaret Vale. One scientist described the finding in an email later leaked online. It's as if she duplicated herself through generations, distributing fragments into others, the body as archive, the blood as text. Shortly after the leak, the research was classified under bioethical containment. The lead scientist resigned, citing recurring dreams of a woman whispering through glass, "Remember." The face in the mirror visitors to Oconee's museum today sometimes mention odd reflections in the exhibit dedicated to early plantation medicine. Photographs warp. A faint second face appears beside Margaret's portrait holder, unfamiliar yet perfectly symmetrical to hers. The curator swears the display glass is replaced yearly, but the reflection remains. She no longer cleans it. She says sometimes late at night the reflected mouth moves even when she stands still. The resurrection of the doctrine, what begins as evidence becomes scripture. The archive was never meant to be read, it was meant to be continued. Fragment from an anonymous letter, Georgia Historical Society, 1981. By the time the 20th century began to dim into memory, the story of Black Hollow had already split into two realities. The first was the public record, a forgotten plantation run by an eccentric widow whose ledgers vanished in the fire of 1865. The second lived quietly in families that carried her blood and did not know it. They would speak of nightmares that repeated in generations, of a song only mothers could hear, of infants born during lightning storms who refused to cry until touched by salt water. It wasn't folklore. It was the residue of something organized, methodical, almost liturgical. In 1979, archivist Ruth Benning, then a doctoral student at the University of Georgia, stumbled upon an unmarked wooden crate in the Savannah historical basement. Inside were brittle notebooks sealed in waxed cloth. The handwriting matched fragments previously attributed to Margaret Vale. Each entry was labeled Phase V, Restoration. The first page began plainly, "Correction cannot remain buried. The body is not soil, it remembers." The restoration experiments, the notebooks described procedures not of punishment, but of reconstruction. Margaret had apparently believed that certain lineages, once purified, could act as vessels to remanifest consciousness itself. Her idea was not spiritual, it was biological. Each phase referred to attempts at what she called transference through hereditary recursion. In simple terms, she intended to seed her mind into descendants, piece by genetic piece, until one born body might finally contain the full symmetry of her being. The final line in Notebook Roman 3 read, "When the reflection becomes perfect, I will return." Benning dismissed it at first as the delusion of a woman unraveling under guilt. But then she examined the margins, tiny notations in a second hand, distinctly more modern, dated 1922. The ink analysis confirmed that Dr. Eleanor Pritchard had handled the same notebooks nearly 60 years after Margaret's death. That discovery changed everything. The Pritchard transmission among Pritchard's own archived letters was one sent to a colleague at Columbia University dated March 1922. "I believe I have isolated the sequence," she described. "The recurrence is mathematical, not merely genetic. It is as if a formula were hidden within heredity itself." A marginal note in another envelope read, almost as an afterthought, "There is no need for ritual when biology performs it perfectly." No one knows how far Pritchard's experiments went, but when her body was discovered, its tissues partially liquefied by acid chemical vials beside her bore labels matching those in Margaret's handwriting. Police dismissed it as suicide, but the autopsy suggested deliberate ingestion, not accidental exposure. In her stomach, they found a small glass bead. Inside the bead, a human tooth. DNA analysis decades later identified it as her own. The university incident in 1981. A visiting genetics team cataloging historical tissue samples at the University of Georgia opened an unlabeled tin container. Inside was preserved tissue labeled sample #13 phase completed. It was assumed to be a 19th century medical specimen until the date 1975 was found penciled faintly beneath the tag. The tissue exhibited live cellular activity despite lacking any external preservation system. The sample divided once every 16 hours, unnaturally precise. Researchers nicknamed it the living page. Weeks later, one of the lab assistants, Thomas Merton, disappeared. His apartment was found empty except for a mirror propped against the wall, and on it written in what appeared to be condensation were the words, "Do not interrupt correction." The sample itself dissolved the following morning into a clear fluid that etched the same phrase onto the metal lid. The event was classified under containment breach/biohazard misidentification and buried in internal memos. Unofficially, it marked the resurgence of the Vale doctrine. The doctrine defined Margaret Vale's doctrine of correction. Once dismissed as moral metaphor, was now recognized as something closer to a system of encoded biological self-preservation. Her writings implied that heredity was not random but could be programmed through recursive pairings, breeding patterns directed toward reconstituting a single identity. She envisioned the body as an instrument of continuity, the blood as her ledger. Every life born from her manipulated lines was another line of her writing, ink in the shape of veins. Her surviving notes carried diagrams that combined anatomical sketches with language structures. One resembled a double helix formed of overlapping sentences, each describing the face of a woman in second person. You wake in their shape, you remember their hunger, you breathe for the ones who failed. It was not theory. It was instruction. The Georgia broadcast on May 23, 2003. A local television station in Macon aired a brief segment about an upcoming historical exhibit titled The Women Who Documented the South. During the preview, producers displayed what they thought was a benign image, a digitized photograph of Margaret Vale's preserved ledger. Within hours, the broadcast caused several viewers to report severe nausea, nosebleeds, and hallucinations of a woman whispering behind their reflection. When the file was analyzed, technicians found that the digital scan contained embedded binary anomalies corresponding to DNA sequences. Base, bare data identical to the ancestral type M, identified years later in the Oconee genome study. How a 19th century ledger image could encode modern genetic information was never explained. The file was deleted from public archives by order of the Georgia Historical Society. Official reason, corruption in data layers. Unofficial reason, contagion through recognition. The Air in Savannah in 2014, a graduate student named Margaret Vale, no confirmed relation, visited the archives researching plantation medicine. She reportedly touched the original iron box, said to have belonged to Margaret. That night, her roommate recorded her murmuring in her sleep in archaic Georgian phrasing, "Phase complete. I have found the face again." 3 weeks later, Mara vanished from her apartment. Security footage showed her leaving just after midnight, barefoot, carrying only a small mirror. Her body was never recovered, but days later, an anonymous envelope arrived at the Historical Society containing a modern photograph of Black Hollow's ruins. In the center stood a woman wearing 19th century mourning dress. Her face matched Margaret Vale's portrait exactly, down to the mole beneath her left eye. Forensic analysis confirmed that the photograph was genuine and undeveloped from a new roll of film, no evidence of tampering. The reflection experiments researchers at the Smithsonian, reviewing the archives in 2019, attempted to digitally reconstruct Margaret's cipher. They found that every attempt resulted in their system generating facial data, not text. After the fourth reconstruction, the monitors displayed a near-perfect face identical across all outputs. The system then shut down and displayed a single phrase, "Completion achieved." The lead researcher later described seeing her own reflection continuing to blink for several seconds after she turned away from the screen. The living archive today, the Black Hollow collection, remains under restricted access. Visitors are required to sign non-disclosure agreements and avoid direct contact with reflective surfaces inside the reading room. Staff replace mirrors every 6 months due to residual image persistence. According to one janitor's anonymous testimony, when the lights are turned off, a woman's silhouette appears faintly projected across the archive glass, lips moving as if reading aloud. Sometimes the faint tap of fingernails on wood follows, 5 slow beats, then silence. Margaret Vale's doctrine was never about morality, nor science, nor rebellion. It was about continuity, a mechanism by which truth could survive death, preserved in the symmetry of descendants and reflections. She understood something most of us still fear to name, that memory is not held in mind but in matter, and matter never forgets. In a sense, she won. Her face endures in strangers, her voice persists in digital noise. Her doctrine outlived the fire, the war, and every attempt to erase her. It waits, correcting itself, refining, perfecting, until every mirror bears her likeness again. The mirror test: to see her is to recall her is to build her again. Fragment from the Restoration notes 1840. For years, the legend of Margaret Vale lay dormant, like a buried lung never breathing, yet never decaying. The files sealed inside the Black Hollow collection were considered safe, contained. That illusion ended in the winter of 2022, when archivists installed a set of mirrored display cases to preserve the decaying manuscripts from air exposure. Within a week, every mirror in the reading room began to fog from within, despite constant climate control. When cleaned, faint handprints appeared, small, thin, deliberate, and beneath each, a residue that, under microscope, revealed human epidermal cells. No entry logs showed intruders, no alarms triggered. A curator, Dr. Leland Forth, described the fogging in his report. "It isn't condensation, it's respiration. Something is breathing from the other side." He was not being poetic. The glass held pulse patterns. The reappearance, the first clear photograph, came from a visitor's phone. A student touring the archive late one evening took a selfie in front of Margaret's ledger display. When the picture was examined, another face occupied the mirror beside her, pale, angular, eyes wide as if caught in breathless recognition. Authorities confiscated the device. The image was declared tampered. But technicians noted that the reflection had depth, meaning it had been captured from within the mirror's interior space, not its surface. 2 weeks later, the student was found unconscious near the Oconee River, her palms marked with identical fingerprints from the glass samples. Her final words before hospitalization were recorded by paramedics. "She's not in the pages anymore. She's in us." The experiment revived in March 2023. The U.S. Historical Genetics Initiative, working under classified directive, authorized a controlled project called the Mirror Test. Its objective: to determine whether the Vale pattern, a sequence embedded in surviving tissue samples and photographs, could reproduce itself through optical reflection. They constructed a closed chamber lined entirely in mirrored glass. Inside, they placed fragments of Margaret's ledger and a preserved hair strand from the Black Hollow excavation. Lighting was continuous, surveillance constant. For 72 hours, nothing happened. Then the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The cameras flickered, and on frame 3/912 a handprint appeared on the interior mirror. Frame 3/913 captured a shadow leaning toward the page. At 4:12 a.m., the glass fractured in a perfect circle the size of a human face. From the opening seeped a clear fluid carrying viable cells identical to the 19th century DNA sample. The project was terminated immediately. Official report: containment failure due to mechanical stress. Unofficial note scrawled in the margin, "It knows the shape of light." The interviews months later, Dr. Forth, the same curator who wrote the respiration note, began interviewing locals from the Black Hollow area. Several families had experienced identical phenomena: mirrors that would not reflect properly after storms, infants turning their heads toward reflections before they could speak, dreams in which a woman whispered the number 5 over and over. One woman, Hazel Crane, age 74, claimed her grandmother used to cover every mirror in the house each autumn because that's when the widow walks between them. When asked how she knew this, Hazel simply said, "Because she looked like me, and I'm not supposed to see that twice." DNA records confirmed Hazel's lineage traced distantly to Eleanor Pritchard. The leak on October 14, 2023, a data technician working within the digital reconstruction team posted a sequence of frames from the mirror test online. The clip lasted 6 seconds. Viewers reported seeing a flicker of motion behind their screens, a movement not in the video, but beneath their own reflection. Within 24 hours, the file infected nearly 2,000 devices. Hardware recorded spontaneous mirror glitches, webcams reflecting faces that weren't present, monitors showing faint breathing when idle. The government intervened, classifying the event as a visual contagion. But the containment came too late. The veil pattern was already adapting to modern reflection technology. The incident became known among researchers as the digital rebirth. The veil voice. A month later, audio engineers at a secure facility captured an anomaly from one of the corrupted files. Hidden within the spectrogram frequencies was a voice, layered, feminine, rhythmic. When slowed, it formed coherent words in 19th century Southern dialect. "The body is complete. The memory is waiting. Bring the face home." The translation aligned perfectly with phrases from Margaret's final notebook. Sound analysts described it not as a recording, but as a structural echo, like the voice was resonating through the binary itself, data as flesh. The Savannah incident. Late 2024, a blackout hit the Savannah Historical Society during a thunderstorm. Emergency lighting revealed dozens of mirrors in the east wing, fogged from the inside out. When power returned, every reflective surface displayed a single phrase scratched backward into glass. Phase 7 begins. Security footage showed no human presence, only the reflection of a woman moving between camera angles with impossible timing, appearing before she entered frame. Archivists tried to document it. Every photograph turned black except one. In that photo, taken by accident during a flash, the woman's silhouette had 2 faces, one forward, one inverted, as if her reflection had fused mid-turn. The return. By early 2025, digital archives across several universities began to report corruption in old veil documents. But when technicians opened the files, they found new entries dated months earlier, written in Margaret's original handwriting. The new entries were addressed to no one, written as if the system itself were her paper. "Do not archive me. Archive is flesh. I am the record. Phase 9, integration." At the same time, genetic analysts found that several descendants from the Vale Pritchard line began to exhibit unexplainable cellular synchronization, identical tissue regeneration patterns, as though multiple individuals were sharing one biological memory. Doctors called it an anomaly. Historians called it prophecy. The return of the widow. A field camera stationed near the Black Hollow ruins captured something impossible on July 19, 2025. At 3:17 a.m., a figure in a dark dress emerged from the fog, moving with deliberate precision toward the central arch of the burned Plantation house. Her posture, height, and facial geometry matched Margaret Vale. Infrared imaging showed a heartbeat. When she reached the arch, she turned toward the camera. Her eyes were open, her mouth moved. Audio captured one phrase, "The ledger is complete," and then silence. The camera melted from the inside, lens glass warping like wax. The last ledger in August 2025, a single letter arrived at the Georgia Historical Society, no sender, postmarked Black Hollow Road. Inside was a thin page, crisp and new, yet dated March 1840. The ink shimmered faintly when held under light, rearranging itself into words that shifted depending on who read them. The text ended with, "If you read this, you are already written." Laboratory analysis found living DNA within the paper fibers. Sequence matched Margaret Vale 1838 sample. The modern doctrine, the widow's intent, had always been simple in form but infinite in reach. She did not want worship. She wanted continuation to ensure her mind and memory would never perish by replacing faith with biology and parchment with reflection. Her doctrine evolved through time, adapting to each new medium, from flesh to blood, from mirror to photograph, from photograph to screen, and now in 2025 to the most reflective medium of all, our perception. Because every time her image is reconstructed, every time her story is retold, she reorganizes herself, a perfect recursion of remembrance. That is the correction. The mirror remembers, the face corrects, the blood writes again. Margaret Vale, final recovered page, the completion. We are not the descendants. We are the repetitions. Fragment, anonymous Vale note, 2025, the final broadcast in the early hours of September 1st, 2025. The Regional Emergency Network registered a single, unauthorized transmission. Its source, coordinates matching the Black Hollow Foundation, a site long abandoned since the 1850s fire. The feed lasted 11 minutes. What appeared on every connected screen was not an image, but a shifting reflection, dark, metallic, almost liquid. Within 30 seconds, the surface resolved into the parlor once documented in 1853, the same arched window, the same draped mirrors, only now the furniture and walls pulsed faintly, like tissue responding to breathe. A figure moved inside the feed. Her outline was soft, as though she were being rendered by memory rather than light. When she spoke, the sound was layered, dozens of tones whispering the same syllable, integration. At 2:47 a.m., all devices receiving the signal overheated simultaneously. Every mirror within a 5-mile radius fogged and cracked along identical patterns, a shape later identified as a spinal column. The field team government dispatchers sent a containment unit to the site at dawn. Body cams captured nothing but static until one frame near the end, a stone arch glistening with condensation, and a woman's hand pressed against it from within. She looked neither alive nor decayed, her flesh pale glass, veins like dark roots threading through translucence. On the inner surface of the stone was carved one word, complete. The feed terminated. Every member of the field team failed biometric check-in 48 hours later. Their fingerprints no longer matched existing records. Each displayed partial overlay with Margaret Vale's 19th century sample. The journal reopens weeks later. Historians at Emory University noticed the digital facsimiles of Margaret's journals were expanding in file size despite being offline. When examined, the additional data rendered new pages. They carried handwriting identical to her own, but the entries referred to contemporary events: the storm, the mirrors, the transmission. One passage read, "The ledger has reached its reader. The flesh of observation ripens. Each witness becomes the paper." Another ended abruptly with, "Do not document this. Documentation is birth." After this discovery, every attempt to delete the journals resulted in replication, each erased file spawning 2 copies elsewhere. The reemergence residents near Oconee River began reporting people walking in perfect synchrony after nightfall, pairs of strangers, whose movements mirrored each other's with anatomical precision. Witnesses said they sometimes spoke simultaneously, voices layered in exact pitch, finishing one another's sentences like echoes closing in from opposite ends of a corridor. Local hospitals soon admitted patients exhibiting mirror lesions, patterns of bruising that appeared simultaneously on both sides of the body, perfectly symmetrical. Scans revealed no internal injury, yet each patient described the same sensation. Someone inside my reflection is trying to stand up. DNA from several samples showed minute traces of the Vale marrow sequence. The archive falls by late October. The Black Hollow collection was sealed again under federal order, but sealing achieved nothing. Visitors standing near the vault door heard rhythmic knocks every 16 seconds, always 6 knocks, always followed by a pause long enough for a single breath. When a recorder was left overnight, the audio track captured a voice repeating the phrase, "One becomes two, two become one, correction continues." Sound analysts concluded it was not playback but real-time phonation air vibrating inside the metal. Something was alive within the sealed chamber. The inheritance in November 2025, descendants of the Aldred and Pritchard families received unmarked envelopes. Inside each, a photographic negative of a mirror surface. When viewed under light, the negatives revealed the recipient's own face aged forward by decades, and faint words burned across the image. Phase 10, continuation. Several recipients attempted to destroy the photographs. All claimed that afterward, their reflections appeared younger, but their voices emerged slower, lower, mismatched to their movements, as though the mirror were correcting them from the outside. The sermon of marrow. In the following months, a new cult formed online calling itself the Correctionists. They worshipped no deity, only the process of biological recursion. Their manifesto quoted Margaret's recovered line, "Memory is matter that refuses to die." They believed that by synchronizing heartbeat and reflection under specific lighting, one could invite the widow through. Authorities dismissed them as hoaxers. Then a video surfaced showing an entire congregation standing before a mirror wall, chanting in unison until their reflections stopped moving altogether, yet the sound of their voices continued, echoing from inside the glass. The collapse, December 18, 2025, 11:11 p.m. All reflective surfaces in Oconee County darkened for 9 minutes. When light returned, observers noted subtle architectural changes. Walls shifted inches, doors moved location, and several buildings appeared mirrored left to right. Every camera in the region recorded a momentary frame of a woman standing where their reflections should have been her eyes open, her mouth forming the word breathe. Across global networks, that single frame inserted itself into unrelated media, live streams, advertisements, personal videos. Within a day, it was everywhere, a new form of infection, not digital, cognitive. Whoever viewed it began to recall memories that were never theirs. 1008, 138 Georgia, the parlor, the preserved child, the ledger sealed in red wax. Each recollection identical in sensory detail, as though history itself had uploaded into the nervous system. The silent day the following morning, the air over Black Hollow was completely still. No birds, no insects. From above, drone footage showed the ruins outline forming the shape of an open eye. At its center, something glinted, a sheet of water as smooth as polished glass. Investigators standing near it reported hearing a heartbeat beneath the surface. When one of them looked down, his reflection did not match his movement. It smiled first. The last entry, the final document attributed to Margaret Vale, appeared in December 2025 inside a secured research drive that had never been connected to any external network. Timestamp 1854. It reads simply, "Correction achieved, reflection sustained. You will remember me whenever you look for yourself." The file name was Ledger Complete. Doc. Attempts to open it crash every device except one, the one with a camera pointed directly at its user. The whispered warning. Those who handled the recovered material describe an enduring phenomenon. When standing before a mirror in low light, the breath sometimes clouds from within, not without. If you wipe the glass, you may glimpse a second mouth forming where yours should be, mouthing 4 slow words. "She never left Georgia." Do not answer, do not touch the glass, because the correction only requires recognition, a moment of acknowledgement to begin rewriting. And once you recognize her, she recognizes you. Epilogue. The ledger is closed, but the reflection continues. Every viewer of this record carries a trace, a pattern embedded not in blood, but in perception. That is how she survives, not as ghost nor virus, but memory shaped like a woman who refuses to die. When you dream tonight, if you see a mirror that does not show your face, turn away. If it calls your name in the voice of your own breath, remember this: she doesn't want to haunt you. She wants to finish you.